Well, hello everyone. Hopefully you can all see me and hear me okay. My name's Martin Pickersgill. I'm a professor of the Sociology of Science and Medicine at the University of Edinburgh, and I'm Director of Research in the Usher Institute. So welcome everyone to the very first session, the very first event of the year of our flagship Usher Institute public facing events programme. So this year we're exploring the theme of new frontiers in health and social cares, and we have a threefold focus. So first, on equality, diversity and inclusion. Secondly, collaboration across disciplines, and thirdly, collaborations beyond academia itself. And everyone is welcome to contribute to these sorts of debates and these discussions, to share your ideas with our teams and our invited guests, wherever in the world you are, and whatever you're doing in the world. So these will be a mixture of events in terms of online and in person. And there's going to be an opportunity as well to propose speakers or topics via a form on our website. So do look out for more events coming through the year, and please do make suggestions. We're really always really excited to hear about people's thoughts, which is just so important. So today, I'm really excited that we're going to welcome today Professor Camara Jones, currently at King's College London, who's going to be hosted by my excellent colleague in Usher, Dr Gwenetta Curry. So I'll hand over to Gwenetta now. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Martin, for the introduction. Yes, we are excited today to have Professor Camara Jones. She is a family physician and epidemiologist who is currently a Leverhulme Visiting Professor in the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine at King's College London. Her work focuses on naming and measuring and addressing the impact that racism has on health and health outcomes and well-being in the United States, as well as the world. Today, Camara will be doing her presentation entitled Confronting Racism Denial, Naming Racism and Moving to Action. Welcome, Camara.
Thank you, Gwenetta. And I'm so delighted to be launching this 2023 Usher Events series. And I will share my screen and get us started. So, Confronting Racism Denial, Naming Racism and Moving to Action, that comes out of my work as starting really in 2016 as the American Public Health Association president 7 years ago, when I launched a national campaign against racism with 3 tasks. The first being to name racism, because we must name a problem in order to get started on the solution. And because racism denial is so staunchly held in my country, and I've only been in the UK for 7 months now, but I would say also here that racism denial is so staunchly held by so many that we must name racism, say the full word, in order to get any traction on addressing it. But as necessary as it is to name racism, it's necessary but insufficient. We must go beyond naming racism and move to action. So the second of 3 tasks, the first part of moving to action, is to ask the question, how is racism operating here in my child's school, in my workplace, in my community, in the world? To do some landscaping, to identify levers for intervention, targets for action. And then once you've identified some promising early targets for intervention, to organize and strategize to act. Because as much power as we do have as individuals to put things on agendas, to challenge things when we see them happening, or to challenge inaction, lack of action in the face of need, as much power as we have to hire a student or whatever it is, we have even more power when we organize and strategize to act, because collective action inspires us, it informs us, it protects us, it propels us. So, but this first, I said, confronting racism denial, it's really about that first part of naming racism. That is the first essential step. And there are 4 key messages when naming racism. The first is that, yes, racism exists. And again, I say that's a key message because in both of our nations and in most parts of the world, racism denial continues to hamper really even engaging around dismantling this system. But so the first is that racism exists. The second is that racism is a system, and we're not talking about individual character flaws. The third key message is that racism saps the strength of the whole society. So it's not just generosity of spirit that makes us concerned about those poor people who have been marginalized, oppressed, stigmatized, but racism is sapping the strength of our whole societies. And finally, the fourth key message is that yes, we can act to dismantle racism. Now, the way that we've structured this morning's conversation is going to let me present a few thoughts, and then I'll be in conversation with Professor Curry, and then we're going to open it up to all of you all who are participating in the webinar, which means that I will basically be telling one of my several allegories on issues of race and racism, but going very deeply into that one. So it means that I won't be able to illustrate all four of those key messages with separate allegories. The first story, and the main story that I'm going to focus on this morning, I call Dual Reality, a restaurant saga. This is the story I tell when I have, say, 6 to 8 minutes to convey to a group of people that, yes, racism exists, even if that group of people has for their whole lives believed that they live in the land of equal opportunity. And the story was sparked by something that happened in my own real life. So let me, before I launch into the story proper, invite you to come into my shoes as a first-year medical student when on a given Saturday, I had awakened early, and like on most Saturdays when I awoke early, what did I do? I started studying immediately, hit the books. And so here I was on Saturday morning, and it was already getting to be early Saturday afternoon, and I was deeply in my studies when some friends came over. Now, my friends were also medical students, so did they distract me from my studies? Oh no, we all got to studying long and hard. And as time progressed, it was getting later and later, and we were getting hungry, and I had no food in the apartment, which was so typical of me that my friends actually understood. And they said, never mind, Camara, we understand you don't have any food in here, but we're hungry. So let's go into town and find something to eat. So we do. So we go into town and we find a restaurant. And we walk in and we sit down and the menus are presented and we order our food and the food is served and here we are eating. So maybe not the story about racism in a restaurant in the United States that people of my generation would have thought I was about to tell, which might have been that we weren't served. But yes, indeed, we were served. So here we are in this restaurant. So now you're wondering, what is this story you're going to tell us about racism exists in this restaurant? Hold on. As I was sitting there with my friends eating, I looked across the room and I noticed a sign that was a startling revelation about racism. So now I hope I've intrigued you and you're wondering, okay, Dr. Jones, what did the sign say? Okay, what did the sign say? The sign said, open. So now I know I may have lost many of you. How is the sign saying open a startling revelation about racism? So let me recap. Here we are sitting in a restaurant eating. I look across the room, I see a sign that says open. Thinking no more about it, I assume that other hungry people can walk in, sit down, order their food and eat. But because I knew something about the two-sided nature of those signs, I recognized that indeed the restaurant was now closed due to the hour, but firmly closed. And that other hungry people, just a few feet away from me, but on the other side of that sign, would not be able to come in, sit down, order their food and eat. And that's when I recognized that racism structures open, closed signs in our society. That racism structures, if you will, a dual reality. And for those who are sitting inside the restaurant at the table of opportunity eating, and they look up and they see a sign that says open, they don't even recognize that there's a two-sided sign going on because it is difficult for any of us to recognize a system of inequity that privileges us. So for example, it's difficult for men to recognize male privilege and sexism. It's difficult for white Americans to recognize white privilege and racism. In fact, it's difficult for all Americans to recognize our American privilege in the global context, although we were living it and still are living it so large in the COVID-19 context and pandemic, with how much of the global supply of vaccine we were sequestering in our nation. Now, those on the other side of the sign are very well aware that there's a two-sided sign going on because it proclaims closed to them, but they can look through the window and see people inside eating. So back inside the restaurant, to those who ask, is there really a two-sided sign? Does racism really exist? I say, I know it's hard for you to know when you only see open. In fact, that's part of your privilege, not to have to know. But once you do know, you can choose to act. So it's not a scary thing to name racism. It's actually an empowering thing to name racism. It doesn't even compel you to act, but it does equip you to act so that if you care about those on the other side of the sign, which is an if, but if you do, why you could even talk to the restaurant owner who is, after all, inside with you. And you could say, restaurant owner, there are hungry people outside. Why don't you open the door and let them come in? You'll make more money. And oh, the conversations we could have. Or maybe what you do is pass some food through the window, or maybe you'll try to tear down that sign or break through the door. But at least what you won't be doing is sitting back saying, wonder why those people don't just come on in and sit down and eat. Because you'll understand something about the two-sided nature of that sign that proclaims open to you. So I use this story now when I have just a few minutes to communicate to a group of people so that they can both understand and communicate on to others that yes, racism exists. It's structuring a two-sided or multi-sided sign. It's creating a dual or multifaceted reality. And in fact, I, on two separate occasions, have started 3-hour-long conversations, 3 hours, with the following question. How could people who were born inside the restaurant know something about the two-sided nature of that sign? And on both of those occasions, these were 3-hour conversations because there are many ways to know. I will say that I'm heartened that more people who were born inside the restaurant and just 2.5 years ago might have been sitting inside eating and saying, what are those people outside saying? Black lives matter? Don't they know all lives matter? More of those people are now actually proclaiming, yes, Black lives matter. More people born inside the restaurant are now saying the word racism, putting together the phrases, structural racism, systemic racism. This is very important and very heartening. But I do have a warning for all of us. As important as it is for us to say the word racism, to put statements on our institutional web pages, to tweet something out or Instagram or however you're rolling with social media, as important as it is for us to say that thing, 6 months from today, we may forget why we said that thing because racism denial is so staunchly held by so many in this nation, in my nation, and so all over the world by so many. And racism denial is so seductive that 6 months from now, if all we do is say a thing, we may be beguiled by what I describe as the sleepiness, the somnolence of racism denial. So we must go beyond naming racism to action. We must tear down the sign. And of course, racism is not just a sign. It's a sign, it's the door, it's a lock. There's a whole system going on. We need to dismantle the lock, take the door off the hinges, because I tell you, once we start acting, we will not forget why we are acting. So I know that I owe you a definition of racism since I've said the word more than a few times. And when I say the word racism, I'm clear that I'm talking about a system. So I'm not talking about an individual character flaw, a personal moral failing, a psychiatric illness, even though, yes, racism can manifest in all of those ways, but in its essence, it's a system of power. And a system of doing what? A system of doing two things, a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value. And on what basis is the opportunity structured? And on what basis is the value assigned? Well, it's based on so-called race. It's based on the social interpretation of how one looks, which is what we call race in our race-conscious societies. And here I'm just being very clear for those of you all who might be confused. There is nothing in our genes that assigns us a race. Race is not written in our genes. Race is the social interpretation of how one looks without people even asking on the street, excuse me, how do you self-identify? Or excuse me, where were you born? Where were your parents born? Or even, excuse me, may I have a little aliquot of your blood? I have an interesting genetic hypothesis. And it's this street race, this socially assigned race, this ascribed race that is the foundation, the substrate on which racism has operated for centuries in our countries and continues to operate today, to do those two things, to structure opportunity and assign value. Now, what are the impacts of this system of racism? Well, when we do recognize that racism exists, and we understand that, yes, it is unfairly disadvantaging some individuals and communities. But it shouldn't take any of us long to recognize that every unfair disadvantage has its reciprocal unfair advantage, so that racism is also unfairly advantaging other individuals and communities. And that's the whole issue of unearned white privilege that we hardly ever talk about, at least in the United States, because it makes some people, especially some people who are living as white, uncomfortable. And I used to almost apologize for that discomfort. I'd say, oh, if you're feeling uncomfortable, I'm not trying to make anybody uncomfortable, shake it off, stay with me, I'll tell you more stories. I don't make that kind of apology anymore. I actually say, if recognizing the truth of unearned white privilege, of the unfair advantage that racism structures into our daily lives and into the history of our whole nations, if that makes you uncomfortable, I encourage you to lean into that discomfort by reading more, especially reading history, talking to strangers, going across town and staying a while, because I have come to recognize that for each and every one of us, the edge of our comfort is actually our growing edge. But there's a third impact of racism that many of us miss, and that is that racism saps the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources primarily, but also how it divides us one from another and even divides some people from their own interest. And there are many examples I could give you of that, because I actually think this is the most important impact of racism to lift up these days. In our media stories, in our data collection, in our conversations around boardroom tables, faculty room tables, dining room tables, because we need to have more people filled with a sense of urgency to dismantle this system. So that just a few examples of how it's sapping the strength of all of us. One is how, at least in the United States, it has resulted in the fact that we, decision makers who are wearing these blinders of racism, don't vigorously invest in the full, excellent public education of all of our children, because the blinders have made them believe that there's no genius in the barrios, the ghettos, on the reservations. We can get along very well, thank you, without those children, when of course, there is genius in all of our communities. And if we were only to vigorously invest in that genius, we could be doing so much better as a nation or even a world. And in the United States, those same blinders that make us not value all of us equally have made us complacent with what I describe as the wholesale warehousing disproportionately of so many Black and brown men and women in our prison system, as if that didn't separate us from human potential. So again, I think that third element, yes, it's important to acknowledge the unfair disadvantage, and equally important to acknowledge the reciprocal unfair advantage, but recognizing that racism saps the strength of the whole society should make all of us committed beyond generosity, right? Beyond altruism, and certainly in response to the oppression of people of color who are being hemmed in ourselves, but to recognize that the whole society is being sapped by the continued operation or lack of doing of this system. That definition that I just gave you of racism, some of you may already recognize, can be generalized to be a definition of any system of structured inequity. So for example, what is sexism? Well, that's a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on gender that unfairly disadvantages some, unfairly advantages others, and saps the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. And I acknowledge that there are many axes of inequity operating in our societies today, intersecting in communities, intersecting in individuals. And all of these axes of inequity are at least risk markers for how opportunity is structured and value is assigned, even as a smaller set are actually risk factors in the progression to disease. Some people might be surprised to hear that I recognize all of these different axes of inequity operating and their associated systems of structured inequity. And I've actually been asked with Dr. Jones, if you do recognize all of this is going on, why has your whole career been centered around race as the axis of inequity and racism as a system of structured inequity? And my answer to that is quite clear. Racism is foundational in my nation's history, the United States. It's foundational in your nation's wealth, right, in the UK. And yet, there are so many people who are in staunch denial of its continued existence and profoundly negative impacts on the health and well-being of our nations. So I earnestly believe that all of us need to at least be actively anti-racism. And I don't even say anti-racist, because if you say anti-racist, people might hear that and they might go, oh, is she talking about me? No, we're not talking about individuals. We're talking about a system. I believe that all of us need to at least be actively anti-racism, even as we also engage around many other systems of structured inequity and axes of inequity. But at least the anti-racism piece, and to the extent that we're able to dismantle the system of racism, the other struggles will benefit as well. But now when I say struggle, and you guys are like, oh my God, because I have come to know that there are many, many people in this world who value comfort. And I've come to recognize that there are many, many people in this world who value social justice. And in the current status quo, valuing comfort and valuing social justice are at opposite ends of a value system. I'm not saying that you can't be comfortable while you work on social justice, but if your value is your individual comfort, until you expand that notion, expand the we who needs to be comfortable to all of us, then valuing comfort and valuing social justice are at polar opposite ends of a value system. And in fact, I've come to understand that those who value comfort are very much like those who were born inside the restaurant, sitting at the table of opportunity, eating. They value comfort because they're benefited by the status quo. They don't even wonder why nobody else is coming in the restaurant. They may not even notice because they're so involved in their food and the company around the table. They may not even want to examine the sign. They may have heard somebody say, oh, there's a two-sided sign going on. In the United States, state by state, they are passing laws making it illegal to even see, is the sign two-sided, making it illegal to talk about race and racism and social justice and health equity, history. And why? Because it makes their children uncomfortable. Those who value comfort don't even care to know what the outsiders are saying. They're not craning to say, what are those people saying outside? And in fact, they don't believe that an outsider could add anything to what they're doing inside the restaurant. They believe they have all of the knowledge and skills that is necessary for them really to thrive. They may have been told that they should diversify their table, right? But they don't believe that an outsider would bring genius or insights or different life experiences to bear to make whatever is going on inside better. They also don't even wonder how the food that they're eating got to them. They don't recognize that those people on the outside who can't come in and eat are the same ones who grew the food, transported the food, brought it around to the kitchen, cooked the food, serving the food, but cannot sit inside and eat. And finally, those who value comfort do not want to budge from their seats at the table. They very jealously guard their what they consider an entitlement, but their privilege. Those on the other side who value social justice because they know two things. The first thing they know is that there's a two-sided sign going on, and many of them know that because they were born outside the restaurant. They have seen that the sign says closed, but they can look through the window and see people inside eating. They also know that the operation of this two-sided sign saps the strength of the whole society. Now, I am not suggesting that the circumstances, excuse me, that the circumstances of our birth completely determine our value system. And I do recognize that there are people who have been born inside the restaurant, but who are wondering, why aren't more people coming inside? They do crane to say, what are those people outside saying? But instead of just sitting and wondering, then they find their way outside. They burst through their bubble of birth experience and experience the common humanity on the other side of that door, on the other side of town, right? And come to recognize that there are people who are just as kind, funny, generous, hardworking, smart as they are, who are living in completely different circumstances. And they come to see with their own eyes the two-sided nature of the sign. And there are those people who have been born outside the restaurant, who through lots of work and lots of credentials and anything it takes, find their way inside the restaurant. Sometimes when I say that anything it takes, sometimes what it takes is a promise from them to never mention that they understand there's a two-sided sign going on, to never mention the reality that it really, things are not open to all. Sometimes, but they get in, and when these people get inside the restaurant, they're often placed near the window so that other outsiders can see them. Sometimes they use their position near the window to stick their foot also in the door to make it easier for other people to come in. But sometimes they're the biggest gatekeepers, keeping other outsiders from entering. We could go into a lot of conversations here about how we come to different understandings, but I have to tell you one thing. I really believe that part of our job right now in anti-racism is to move more people from valuing comfort to valuing social justice, even as we recognize that in the current situation, in the status quo, valuing social justice will not always, or maybe not ever, be comfortable. Now, if I had more time, I would share with you another of my allegories, actually the first allegory that became very well known more than 20 years ago, published in 2000, My Levels of Racism, A Gardener's Tale, which would help us understand why should we shift more people from valuing comfort to valuing social justice? Why? And it's because racism impacts health. And in that story, I talk about initial historical injustices, which then result in structural racism, personally mediated racism, and internalized racism. And although today I do not have the time to share with you this whole allegory, which illustrates those three levels of racism and also illustrates what we need to do to set things right, including at least addressing the structural racism, with the promise that if we address the structural racism, the other levels may take care of themselves. I refer you to my 4-page paper, quick, which includes a description of these levels of racism and the Gardener's Tale. And if you want to just look at it on a video, there are many people who've taken my voice without authorization or whatever, but you'll find many video versions of the Gardener's Tale online. But I sent you to this one, which was a 2002 interview of me by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. That is, if you will, the authorized version. There's also a TED Talk that I did in 2014, which includes the Gardener's Tale and 3 other allegories that might interest you. So what can we do today? Well, going back to that image of the dual reality restaurant saga, first of all, I encourage, actually charge all of us to actively look for evidence of two-sided signs, to actively ask, is there something differential going on here by race, by gender, by language, by immigration status, by nationality, by religion, by any of the ways that we divide one another from each other, looking not only at outcomes, health outcomes, educational outcomes, social care outcomes, but also at opportunity structures. Is there something differential going on here? looking for evidence of two-sided signs. We also need to burst through our bubbles of experience to experience our common humanity on the other side of town. Now, all of us live in a bubble of experience, our families, our jobs, our communities, social things that we're doing. Some of our bubbles are quite vast with thin soap bubble boundaries. Some of our bubbles are smaller with thicker plexiglass boundaries. Some of our bubbles have been tinted. Some of our bubbles have been polarized. In the United States, some of our bubbles have been hardened by fear. But no matter what kind of bubble each of us finds ourselves in, most of us do not really know that just on the other side of town, there are people who are just as kind, funny, generous, hardworking, smart as we are, who are living in very different circumstances. We need to create, at the individual as well as institutional levels, opportunities to burst through our bubbles and experience our common humanity on the other side of town. We need to be interested in the stories of others, and then believe the stories of others without requiring cell phone video documentation or, God forbid, body cam footage. And then we need to join in the stories of others. And I'm actually heartened that these days that's happening more and more. We need to develop a sensitivity to the absence of who is not at the decision-making table, what is not on the agenda, what policies are not in place that if put in place could bring about more social justice. We need to reveal inaction, lack of action in the face of need, because that is how structural racism very often shows up these days. But all the power is not just within those who are inside the restaurant. Those of us on the outside need to know our power, need to recognize that action is power. And as I said before, especially that collective action is power, because collective action informs us, inspires us, propels us, and protects us. But I'm going to close as I try with this simple talk to encourage you to join the collective of those who are wanting. Those of us who value social justice, I want to share with you what I call my 4 BCs. These are habits of mind for social justice warriors. And they are: be courageous, be curious, be collective, and build community. So just a little detail on each of these 4 BCs. When I say be courageous, I mean speak your truth. Be unafraid of controversy. In fact, embrace challenge and know that the edge of your comfort is your growing edge, because that is true for all of us. So be courageous. The second BC is to be curious. So ask why, and then why again, and ask these serial whys so that you aren't satisfied with superficial explanations of what we see in the world, but we start identifying and understanding root causes. Be curious means to read widely and read history, to stay woke to what's happening in the current day, and walk in wonder. Walk with a curiosity about what each person you meet has to teach you, because each of us has something to teach one another. And learn more than one language, because language is a portal to another whole bubble, if you will, of experience. And finally, to travel as much as you can, both across town, so important. Many of us may have traveled around the world, but not across town, but travel as much as you can, both across town and around the world. So be curious. The third BC, be collective. Care about the whole. Share your ideas, your time, your energy, your stuff, material stuff with others. Recognize yourself as a world citizen and organize, because collective action is power. So be collective. And finally, build community. How? Well, be interested, believe, and join in the stories of others. So that means talk to strangers. Talk to strangers in your own neighborhood or in your own department or on the bus or on the tube or in the airplane. Then create bubble bursting opportunities so that we can experience our common humanity on the other side of town. Speak up and take action on behalf of others. And really, it's about going across town and staying a while. So build a community. So with that, I am pleased to invite you into, first of all, well, Professor Curry, for our conversation. And then hopefully we'll have a lot of good discussion with those who are listening.
Thank you so much for your talk. Very well done. And I know there are going to be a lot of questions here, but I wanted to start off a conversation because across the UK, there've always been a lot of focus on class and some resistance on the conversation around race and ethnicity. And I'm also from the US. I've been in the UK for almost 4 years. It's 3.5 years now. And you know, it's very easy to talk about the class conversation, but there's challenges when you talk about race and ethnicity. And in the States, there's so much overlap between race and ethnicity. And when we had, you know, President Barack Obama, everybody was like, oh, wow, you know, post-racial nation. And but we know that's definitely not the case. How do you move that conversation forward so that people don't fall into the hole of thinking if you solve poverty, you solve racism?
Okay, so thank you. That's a very important question. First of all, just with the election of President Obama, it signaled the change in race relations enough for him to get elected, but it did not change the structural aspects of racism. No one person can do that by themselves, and it might be an intergenerational effort. It might take 1 or 2 generations for all of us working together to dismantle this system. So that's an important thing, that it was an important signal. But then as we saw after President Obama was President Trump. And so we have to recognize and prepare as people who are anti-racism, social justice warriors, that part of doing that is not just the work of addressing oppressive opportunity structures or addressing and countering dehumanizing value systems, but part of it is recognizing and preparing for the backlash. For the pushback. But the question so that was just an aside. The question you asked me is, when people recognize social class disparities, why does it seem to keep them from recognizing racism in the UK context? I mean, this is an important thing, because there are social class disparities in the UK and in the US and around the world. The first thing is that we have to recognize that the way racism intersects with that is that it doesn't just so happen that people of color in the UK or in the United States are overrepresented in poverty, while white people in both of our countries are overrepresented in wealth. That is not just a happenstance. And for each marginalized, stigmatized, oppressed group, there's been some initial historical injustice, which is being perpetuated by present day contemporary structural factors in our laws and all of that. That structural racism shows up as inherited disadvantage and its reciprocal inherited advantage. And that shows up in close social class distinctions. The second thing is, most people will recognize the highest level closed sign that they encounter, right? So all of us are walking through the world, walking through doors that open up so far in advance of us that we didn't even realize there was a door there when you think about automatic doors, right? But we will recognize when we come to that door that is closed to us. So it is people who are white who are recognizing that if they are disadvantaged, if they're poor, whatever, they're recognizing the poverty closed door without recognizing the white privilege open doors for them. Because yes, whiteness will not protect you from poverty. It will not protect you from homophobia. It won't protect you from those other things, but whiteness does give you white skin advantage, which is a, kind of high expectations, relative safety in police encounters, benefit of the doubt, and many of these other things. But when people experience them and feel that those are their human entitlements or givens that should be given to all of us, but it is not. And so people who are white recognize themselves as fully human without recognizing that racism is constraining the experience of full humanity of people of color. So this is the main problem, that yes, there's a very strong caste system in the UK, a white caste system that you recognize as social class in this country. There's a very strong caste system in the US as well. That caste system does not just happen to overlap with race. It's because of historical injustices. But when you don't recognize, when we are ahistorical, as we are in all of our nations, and so we don't know our histories, when we think that the current distribution of advantage and disadvantage is just a happenstance, or when we believe in the myth of meritocracy, or those people, if they only worked harder, they would make it, type of thing, without recognizing that that is a myth, that yes, most people who have made it have worked hard, but there are many other people working just as hard or harder who will never make it because of an uneven playing field, which has been structured and perpetuated by racism and sexism and capitalism and all these other things. When we deny the pertinence or even existence of these systems of structured inequity and blame those who haven't made it for being lazy or stupid, that's all part of the same thing. So the short answer is, there are class differences in both of our countries. There's racism in both of our countries. If we just deal with the class differences without recognizing the racism, then we might move part of our population away from a cliff of good health without moving the whole population away from the cliff of good health. And so, I mean, that's related to another of my allegories, the cliff analogy. Google it, cliff analogy, and then you'll understand. So I am particularly interested in my work here in helping people recognize those 4 key messages: that racism exists even here, yeah, that racism is a system, that racism even here is sapping the strength of the whole society, and that yes, we can act to dismantle racism. And that goes for all the other systems of structured inequity as well. But when you are in a system that is denying that racism exists, you will never get started on the problem. So the first thing is to confront that racism denial. Say racism exists, and then we can get going.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Yeah, I think there's a lot of conversation around, in the last couple of years around racism, and people being more open to having the conversation, but there's still some resistance in acknowledging that, it is a serious problem here. One of the issues we have across Scotland, there's not a lot of great data on race and ethnicity in terms of health outcomes and data tracking. It's lacking in a lot of ways. And it's only recently that the NHS started asking for your, ethnicity when certain, when they're doing certain things. Even with the vaccine, they've done it with, I believe, with the last booster, but at the beginning, they weren't asking these questions. And that's lost opportunity. And the idea is that, this is not something they need to know. We just need to know like who's taking the vaccine and what are the outcomes. But, these lost opportunities are leading to, more denial that there's an issue, right? If you don't have the data, I mean, it's just like France. France is like, oh, we don't have these ethnic, we just have people that are French, right? But here it's very clear that there's a need for data, because if you want to address a problem, especially with policy change, you have to have data-driven policy, and those things are important. And there's 2 sides to the data conversation. I think that you were part of the conversation that was happening in Glasgow, where it's like, okay, we have these gaps in data, it's important, but how do we securely, make this data public? There's a concern around, will it lead to stigmatization of certain groups if you release the data? I'm of the vein that if someone is going to do something, if they have a racist lens, they're going to use it with or without the data being published.
Right.
What are your thoughts around these gaps in data, and how do we move, the mark on this?
So that's part of inaction in the face of need. If there is even a question, is there something differential going by race, then we must measure that to answer the question. Once we start measuring, if you find, oh, there's no difference, and that should be reassuring. But really, when you can look with your eyes and see, on the street, people in different job categories, or lack of representation in different levels of leadership or education or whatever, when you can see that people, the mental health diagnoses and even treatments differential by different groups, you need to be able to monitor that in order to see whether your interventions will have any impact. If you don't intend to intervene, it's only in that case that you say we don't need the data. But that inaction in the face of need, or even the indifference, not collecting these data represents indifference in the face of need, right? Which is another hallmark of structural racism. So if anybody has a question, if there's something differential going on by race, we need to actively look for evidence of two-sided signs. We need to collect the data to answer, is there something differential going on in terms of outcomes as well as in terms of opportunity? That is the first step. So, and what is the possible stigmatization? So there's no data are not going to add any more stigmatization to what's going on in the world. You know, as you say, the stigmatization is operating in the world. And what we need to do is to reveal it, to pull back the blinders and see what we have, because in that way, then we can start marshaling our resources and asking, well, now we have evidence that racism is operating here. There's something differential going on by race here. How is it operating? It can help us then target our interventions, right? If we have no intention to address those racial disparities because we think they're given, or they don't bother us because we're advantaged by the system, without recognizing that those people who aren't able to live their full lives, you know, like it's not just a problem for that family that woman died, you know, 20 years before her time or whatever. It's a problem for the whole society until we start recognizing the lost genius, the lost contributions, the lost leadership, the lost creativity, the lost all of it. Until we start recognizing that the operation of this system, racism, is sapping the strength of all of us, of the whole society, then the blinders that make us not recognize the loss are part of the problem. We need to measure if there's a question, and then we need to ask, how is racism operating here? Gwenetta, I know I've answered a very long thing, and I know you might have another question, but I haven't gone into detail on how you answer, how is racism operating here? May I, in 1 minute?
Yeah, in 1 minute, go ahead. And then we'll go to the question they have in the Q&A.
Okay,
yeah.
So that question, how is racism operating here? What you're trying to look at are structures, policies, practices, norms, and values. And for many of you listening, you're like, oh my God, that didn't help me. You just gave me a headache. Structures, policies, practices, norms, and values. What are you talking about? It feels like that until we recognize that those things, structures, policies, practices, norms, and values, are actually the elements of decision-making. Structures are the who, what, when, and where of decision-making, especially who's at the table and who's not, and what's on the agenda and what's not. If structures are the who, what, when, and where of decision-making, policies are the written how of decision-making. Both practices and norms are the unwritten how of decision-making. Practices, just watch me, you'll see what we're doing here. Norms, more deeply embedded, how we've always done things and how we expect you to do things going forward. And values are the why of decision-making. So if you start, I have found that if I'm talking to a new audience, you know, on children of color and exposure to nature, whatever, I think, well, how is racism operating here? If I spend 5, 10, 15 minutes with that question, thinking about who's at the table and who's not, what's on the agenda, what's not, what are the written policies, I can generate 5, 10, 15 early targets for action, levers for intervention for that group to get started. So that's, you should take that question, how is racism operating here, with you everywhere, so that we can start landscaping and identifying targets for action.
Thank you. All right, now I'm going to go to the Q&A. And the first question I have from Amanda said, I love your talk. Thank you so much for your time. Do you have any suggestions on how to show we are a safe space for people of color to give their honest experience? I'm aware as a white woman, American too, that I might make people of color uneasy, even engaging. White women have sometimes shown not to be a safe space. So,
well, you have to be honest, right? You have to acknowledge that racism exists, as opposed to coming in with a stance of, well, prove that there's something going on here. I think that's at the moment that you acknowledge that racism exists and that you are not just an ally, which is ally feels a little distant to me. When you're an ally and it's time for your vacation, you might say to the others, okay, check you in a month, hope the struggle goes well. No, yeah. that you're a compatriot, that you know that we are compatriots in this struggle against racism. If that's the stance you're coming from, then it doesn't matter if you aren't practiced saying certain words or whatever. If you come in acknowledging that we're dealing with a real situation and not from a stance of skepticism or racism denial, then you will be a safe space because you will be joining in the anti-racism struggle.
Excellent, thank you. The next question is from Sonia, said, how do we attempt to navigate the opening of the conversation on race on local levels and institutions where boardrooms are the people inside the restaurant? What approach could this be done in, and which meaningful engagement that can become action-led can be had and not just philosophizing, for lack of a better word? Everything moved.
So
yeah, of racism as a tick box exercise.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is hard, right? When the people inside the restaurant don't even believe that there's a problem there, right? And they don't even want to read, or they don't want to read the other side of the sign. They don't want to know. Mm-hmm. So I really think that to the extent that we can create bubble bursting opportunities, even for those board members, to get to what would it look like for a board? Well, maybe it's some kind of joint work with another institution that is minority led or whatever, or with a community. Maybe it's recognizing that inside outside strategies are important. If you're intersecting with a community, you don't just go to the community and tell them what they need, but you invite that voice and see if you can be invited to their decision-making tables or whatever. But it has to do with recognizing our common genius, our common mission. So it has to do with those people inside the restaurant, if they don't even have curiosity about what's going on outside, that somebody has to create a bubble bursting experience for them. And not just a one-off voyeuristic, let's drive through this neighborhood kind of experience, but a real kind of settled getting to know people on the other side of town. In the long run, if we're working with young people, then it's perhaps, so I mean, from the US perspective, there was Peace Corps, which got people outside, but they still didn't, outside the country, but they still didn't recognize what was going on inside the country, or AmeriCorps, or, kind of some kind of compulsory service after a certain level of education that gets people in other people's communities to stay a while. But there has to be a breaking through of the insular boundaries that some people find protective, but are actually strangling the society and not even helping them.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think that, that idea behind co-production is so important. And I think so often researchers will go in a voyeuristic way to come observe communities or go and extract from communities and not actually work with the communities. A lot of the times communities have their own efforts that they're doing to solve their own problems without the engagement of outside forces, right? Sometimes as researchers, people go in and say, oh, you need X, Y, Z. It's like, let's listen to what the community people are saying. There was a project done by a group called Prospect, and they interviewed a lot of Black and brown people across the UK, particularly in Edinburgh, and they talked about their experiences of trying to get hired, just employment on the basic level. And some of them had to remove the word PhD off of their CV to get a job. And it's like, how is that, and some of them with PhDs are working as Uber drivers and, different delivery systems just because they couldn't get hired in their own profession. And they noted that when they moved to England, this is people that are in Scotland, when they moved to England, they were hired within 6 weeks. So what is it about Scotland in particular that they had this challenge? But yeah, that's just a side note there. But I wanted to go into Sonia's last question. She asked about data collection in a world where there's understandably mistrust of research in the research world. How do we develop community engagement efforts to be more positively inclusive of marginalized communities?
You have to respect. So I want to tie the answer to that question to something you said before, Gwenetta. You said sometimes communities are trying to solve their problems. All the time, communities are trying to solve their own problems. And all the time, they have efforts which are working, which might be able to use more resources, whatever. And so the first step is to recognize that communities are not abandoned wastelands, that there are people in communities trying to solve their own problems. And so to come with that respect and if you have resources, financial resources, organizational, whatever, to put them at the disposal of the community without kind of over direction. So now get me back to that particular question, because it was tied in a little bit, but that was my response to something you said before. So what is the core part of this question, of the second question?
Just pretty much, how do you have data collection in a world where communities don't trust researchers?
Okay, well,
yeah.
So that gets us to even what kind of data do we really need when we're looking at the impacts of racism? Because there are self-identified race ethnicity data that we could ask people for or not. But really racism, it's my experience, and certainly in the United States, operates on the social assignment of how people look in a race-conscious society. So there could even be, you could go all the way back and just have people check off the race for other people without even asking, because that is the substrate on which racism is operating day to day. So I honestly believe that not with regard to cultural things, or, perhaps political units where you want to ask, because, within South Asian people, Bangladeshi and Pakistani and Indian are very different, kind of situated in terms of history as well as in terms of political power in this country and all like that. So those distinctions are have different things. But if you're talking about experience on the street, I don't know how refined the racism eye is for those different groups. So it would come to having some kind of consensus. What are the socially assigned groups in Scotland? What are the socially assigned groups in the UK more broadly, and whatever. And then you could actually either ask people, how do other people usually classify you in this country, and have people designate among those socially assigned groups how they're usually classified. Or all else being off the table, you could have people who are interested in documenting the impacts of racism do that social assignment themselves, check things off as an early start to understand how racism is operating here. It's not to assign, it's to reflect the social assignment that's already going on in the society.
Absolutely. We have 3 minutes, but maybe we can squeeze in this last question before I hand it over to Martin. Just a quick question from Lena. Said, how can we benefit from the lived experiences and truly diversify communities / groups without putting too much burden on the few minoritized individuals who are currently within the institution?
Right. So the whole minority tax issue of, okay, so now the institution's interested in equality, diversity, inclusion, and we need to add anti-racism to all of that. And now you're supposedly the only expert who can do this. So first of all, we need to engage other people in this struggle, so that it's not just the people of color who are doing anti-racism work. It's to recognize the value of that work, and to in terms of academic progression, to reward that kind of work, and to reward the mentoring of students and all of that at the same level that we reward research, things that sometimes we as people of color faculty members don't have time to dig so much into our research, because we're doing all the other stuff that's being asked of us because the institution is newly woke, right? It is to bring more people of color in, and especially the whole strategy of cluster hires, so that nobody ever finds themselves as being the only one, and then they get burnt out, and so they leave, and then there's another person in the institution who comes in as the only one. If you bring in 5 or 6 people, that's not to say they all have to be friends. 5 or 6 people of color, they don't all have to be friends, they don't all have to be working on the same subject, but at least when they see one another, they will respect the full humanity and intellect in each other, and it will help to diminish some of that burden as well. And it's to engage our white colleagues in this work. They shouldn't be coming in ignorant and leading these efforts. They need to educate themselves, not even wait to be educated, but educate themselves by reading history, going across town, staying while talking in community, being embedded in community, and then take on some of this shared leadership as well.
Well, thank you very much, Camara. I am going to hand over to Martin now. Thank you so much. It's been a great talk, and hopefully we could connect again afterwards.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Jones. That was just absolutely, it was just brilliant and challenging. And I really, really appreciate the time that you've taken out to both deliver the kind of the lecture today, but also the time that you've taken sort of across a career to build up this this fabulous and important body of work. So thank you so much for sharing these reflections and provocations, more importantly, with us today at Usher, and far beyond Usher, of course. I just want to flag now our next event, which is going to be a panel discussion on European perspectives on integrating health and social care through digitalization, and that's going to be chaired by my Usher colleague, Catherine Cresswell. And as I've mentioned at the beginning, we'd really very much welcome further suggestions from people on how we can to follow through really with our kind of thematic focus around equality, diversity and inclusion, and the kind of collaborative dimensions of that. We would really welcome suggestions and feedback as well. I'm really grateful for everyone who's attended today. It's great to see. Well, I was going to say so many faces. It's so many names on the participant list, I should say. But obviously, thanks also due to Lorna Thompson, Laura Marshall, and Susan Buppingham for doing all the work setting this up. It's a huge amount of back-scenes work with events like this, and we're all hugely grateful to them for that. So once again, thank you so much, Professor Jones, and thank you, Gwenetta, as well for kind of chairing and facilitating that provocative discussion at the end. So thank you all. And I think that's us done. So thank you.